This town in Florida calls itself The Villages. With over 20,000 inhabitants, it has all the attributes of a real town. But it's not. It's what they call an active adult community, a retirement colony.
You know, I worked so hard all the week, you know, and last Sunday before last was such a birthday day and all. You know, I worked so hard all the week, you know, and last Sunday before last was such a birthday day and all and everything.
The Villages even has its own cable television station that runs news reports about goings-on in the town. One of its on-camera reporters is Sharon Schreppel, who roams the community with her cameraman.
We're not going to get your wrinkles.
Oh, good. And on my chin.
Just keep your shoulders back. We're not gonna, no, you know what? If you lift your chin just a little, you're good too.
In the Villages, you have to be 55 to buy a house. The average age is in the late 60s, and no one under 18 may live here. Sharon herself is a widow of 63. This is a refuge for the aged.
I'm trying to get the hang of this, but I'm not too sure. It looks like a lot of fun, but I can't get my feet to coordinate with my head. This is a wonderful atmosphere. You have to remember, we have sunshine almost 90% of the time, so that you can get outdoors and do things, and you're meeting new friends, and you're doing things that perhaps through your whole life because you worked, you never had a chance to do.
It's nice to see old people having a good time, but easy to forget just how new this phenomenon is. Just a few decades ago, only a small minority of us lived beyond 65. That has changed utterly. Sunny Florida is the chosen resting place for millions of America's retired people. As a result, nearly 1 person in 5 in this state is over 65. But if this elderly environment seems strange to you, consider this. Here in Florida, you are looking at the future of humanity. Because over the next 30 years in the world's developed countries, including Britain, there will be a massive transformation. For the first time in human history, old people will outnumber the young. The implications of this change will be profound. Right across the Western world, the age wave will impact upon pensions, healthcare, and work.
In this coming century, we're going to have clear shortages of workers, and we're going to need more workers. And one place to get more workers is to have the elderly work longer.
Something we'll have to give here, and I think it will be a combination of higher retirement ages and somewhat less generous pensions in the future.
It's going to affect health because there are going to be many more people in the older age groups, which are typically much more expensive in terms of health care.
The gym at the Villages. The age wave isn't guesswork. It is a future which, you could say, has already happened. In the years after World War II, in Western countries, there was a baby boom, followed after 1970 by a birth dearth. The population bulge of the baby boomers reaches retirement age in the next 10 years. That's when the aging crisis will start to bite. What's about to happen you could call the Floridization of the developed world. Today, 1/5 of people in the retirement state of Florida, like incredibly these rollerbladers, are over 65.
If the music make you move, 'cause you can dig the groove.
Tomorrow, whole countries will be like Florida. By 2016, in Britain, 1/5 of people will be over 65. By 2030, 1/4 of all the people in the developed world will be 65 or over. But the people living in the villages are probably the last generation who can enjoy 30 years of active and financially secure retirement.
Ask any of them, they'll say we're living in the best of times. No matter how hard the struggle was, it still is the best of times. And yes, I think they feel very fortunate, and I think they are worried about their children and their grandchildren in the coming years.
A man who's made a special study of the coming ageing crisis is former American Commerce Secretary Peter Peterson. Does he think those happy retired people in Florida are the last privileged generation?
I think that the future generations of elderly are going to have a much tougher time than this generation of elderly by and large. Yes.
They're going to have to work for longer?
They're going to have to work longer, and they're going to have to save more.
Christchurch in Dorset is the area in Britain most like Florida. The age wave has arrived here too, for it has Britain's oldest population. And the age wave is increased by those we regard as elderly because they no longer work. Looking after his cabin cruiser is Norman Holland. He's 62, but retired years ago. A former senior official at Lloyds Bank, he was eased out when he was just 53, though official retirement was at 60.
My feelings are that you should have gone to the age of 60, which is what you expected to do when you joined the financial world. And I think you should have gone to that stage. In my particular instance, I was grateful, if I was honest, to come out at that time, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my life since.
But you didn't have any choice in the matter, you had to retire.
Exactly, yes.
Norman's experience is increasingly common in industrial countries, and Britain in particular. Today, 2/3 of workers retire before they're 60. Most British companies seem to regard employees over 50 as old and ready for their pension.
They don't want the older employees there so much now. It's the younger person who will probably work for a shorter period of time than we worked, possibly. And they may well come out still in their sort of early 50s now. I just felt that they didn't really want us there, if you like, hence this early retirement programme.
So Britain's culture of early retirement increases the number of those we consider elderly. And the elderly will form a growing proportion of society. There will soon be more people of Norman's vintage than youngsters. One reason is in a way a blessing. On average, we are living longer. Medical advances have pushed up life expectancy from the mid-40s to 75 in the developed world. Over the next 30 years, it's projected to rise even further, swelling the ranks of those considered to be old. But there's something else. This is Christchurch's maternity unit. Here there's evidence of change at the other end of the age range. The other reason is that since around 1970, we have had too few babies. To keep the population stable, each couple should have 2. But at an average of 1.7, Britain is below the so-called replacement level. In due course, the population will fall, and there will be a shortage of young workers. But some of our European partners have even lower fertility levels. In Italy, they have the lowest birth rate in the world, just 1.2 babies per couple, well below replacement level. An expert on this vexing problem is Antonio Golini, Professor of Demographics at the University of Rome.
If we can imagine that this fertility will remain the same in the next 2 centuries, just to make a statistical speculation, Italian population could disappear. But this is just to understand how low is the Italian low fertility.
These southern Italian children are waiting to be picked up for school. Vincenzo Venditti is mayor of Vasto Girardi, a town in the mountains. He voluntarily collects children from outlying villages just in order to maintain the numbers in his town school and keep it from being closed. In 3 decades, Vasto Girardi's population has fallen from 3,000 to a little over 800. Last year, 15 inhabitants died, but there were only 3 births. There are 7 12-year-olds in this class. 20 years ago, there were 3 times as many.
Valentino, Cinzia.
It is hardly worth the effort of calling the register. But there are only 4 6-year-olds. The younger the class, the fewer the children. Everyone here knows that the town schools are likely to close in a few years' time.
È una questione che vedo abbastanza difficile e molto grave, sono abbastanza preoccupato perché abbiamo già una popolazione anziana che percentualmente è intorno al 60% degli attuali residenti, per cui se continua questo trend di morte e di nascite, nel giro di 10 anni noi avremo una popolazione dimezzata, quindi con un rischio serio, concreto, di dover abbandonare il nostro paese.
Buongiorno.
Senta, vorrei uno sciroppo per la tosse.
È una tosse secca.
Vincenzo Maracino is Vasto Girardi's chemist, typical of today's independent-minded Italian woman. Although in her 40s, she is childless and married only 2 months ago. She thinks there are many reasons why Italian women have so few children.
Una di queste è il fatto che sono entrate così prepotentemente nel mondo del lavoro e c'è la voglia di fare carriera e anche di riscattarsi un po' da secoli di stato di casalinga, e poi perché vogliono comunque una sicurezza economica per avere dei bambini.
Many of Vasto Girardi's dwindling population are single adults. The men seem content to remain bachelors.
Vasto Girardi è un'abitudine consolidata quella di restare a casa dalle mamme. Un po' è anche il fatto che non si trova facilmente lavoro, quindi si ha la possibilità di crearsi famiglia abbastanza tardi.
In the evenings, in the bars of the town, the mayor tries to persuade the single men to do their duty towards the survival of the Italian race, to get married and have children.
Oltre a giocare a carte, cerchiamo di arrivare al dunque e andare a questo matrimonio.
He has threatened to levy a tax on those who don't get married.
C'è una promessa che nel 2001 massimo vi sposate, non applichiamo la tassa, altrimenti saremo costretti ad applicare la tassa.
Ma i figli sempre con la stessa donna?
No,
I figli sempre con la stessa donna o...
Però dovete cercare una soluzione in tempi rapidi,
sì,
perché fra 2 anni la scuola materna chiude e poi chiuderemo le altre scuole se non arriveranno i bambini. Quindi avete un obbligo morale per il vostro paese di fare famiglia e fare figli.
Fare un figlio non è questione di... bisogna sapere con chi e con chi.
Sì, però questo...
And more of Vasto Girardi's dozens of bachelors await the mayor's exhortations in the other bars of the town. The empty school gives a clear warning of the future shortage of young workers. The key indicator in the coming ageing crisis is the so-called dependency ratio. That's the number of economically active workers as against the number of dependent pensioners. In Britain, this dependency ratio is currently 3.5 workers to every pensioner. By the mid-century, it will be down to 2.1 workers per pensioner. Other European countries will suffer an even worse plight. In Germany, the ratio will be 1.4 workers per pensioner. And in Italy, 0.7. In other words, there will be a pensions crunch. Every tax-paying worker will be single-handedly supporting not just himself and his family, but also a pensioner whom he does not know. An unprecedented burden. That's because Europeans overwhelmingly rely upon state pension schemes. In Italy, for example, you can draw a generous state pension as early as 55. Like Italy's, most state pension schemes are pay-as-you-go, which means that pensioners are paid out of the current contributions of today's workers. They were set up in the era when workers massively outnumbered the retired and average life expectancy was below 65. But soon, many such schemes will be unsustainable. Either wage earners will suffer with higher taxes, or the retired will be receiving pensions much lower than those they forlornly assumed they had paid for and are entitled to. As it is, Italy's social security spending eats up a huge slice of its national wealth. Currently, it is 19% of GDP. Without reform, by 2030 it will theoretically be a third, which would be unsustainable. European politicians are coming to terms with the need for reform, but so far progress has been very limited.
It's very difficult for politicians to take the tough actions necessary to solve the problem, because all the actions that you need to take to remove the solvency problem are painful. You either increase the retirement age, reduce the generosity of pensions, or increase the contribution rates, that's the tax rates effectively, paid by current workers. None of those things are popular. That's why I think movements in Europe to put the pension system on a more sound footing have been rather slow and are far from complete yet.
But the coming age wave means that reform of Europe's state pensions is unavoidable, however painful it will be. In Britain, because fewer pensioners rely on the state scheme, we won't suffer the pensions crunch in 10 years' time as badly as our European neighbours will. But Britain too has its potentially unsustainable public promise: to look after people's health from the cradle to the grave. The hospital in Christchurch, with Britain's oldest population, spends over half its budget on the over 65s. Dr. Damien Jenkinson is a specialist in the rehabilitation of stroke victims.
Okay, well, shall we see how he's getting on? Yeah. Well, I hear you've been doing very well at Bournemouth before you came over to see us. I'd be keen to see how you are on your feet today. Do you feel up to it?
Yes, all right.
Okay, well, with the help of my colleagues here, I think we'd like to see what your walking is.
Try and lift your feet as you did just then. That's it.
Strokes chiefly hit the over 70s. In Christchurch, the coming years will see more and more people in that vulnerable age group.
You know, after stroke, most people continue to make recovery, and it takes some time. I think you're looking at being with us for a few weeks.
I see.
So I think it's important that you know the sort of timescale that we're talking about. But certainly
With a constantly ageing population, will the NHS and geriatric services like this especially be overwhelmed?
Thank you very much.
If we're not careful, that could be the case. 2/3 of hospital beds in acute hospitals are occupied by elderly people over the age of 65 years. There is a rising tide of admissions, particularly in the winter, and we have a winter crisis. We need to carefully determine the best way to care for elderly people in the future.
But as things stand, the number of hospital beds in this country has been going down and down, hasn't it?
Yes, without significant intervention, the situation is really no longer tenable.
Author of a book he gloomily entitled Agequake is Paul Wallace. He believes that with more old people in society, cost pressures on the NHS will result in what to politicians and doctors is unmentionable: rationing.
You've already got rationing in the health service, and this is with the current number of older people in the population, and you're going to get a big increase in the number of older people in the population, and we know that typically spending on older people is much higher than it is on people, say, under 65, and the spending is particularly high for people in their 80s, and we're going to have a big increase in their number. So this is bound to intensify the pressures towards some form of limitation of healthcare, but this is an incredibly difficult issue, and you can rely upon politicians to do their utmost to duck it.
But it's in the labour market that demographic change will bite hardest. Here in Florida, it already has, even in the Villages retirement community. In the Western world, the birth rate has fallen since the 1960s, so there's a shortage of young people entering the workforce. America's booming economy has brought full employment and a tight labour market now. Here in Florida, retired people are actually needed back at work. Nancy Centreel spent her working life as a secretary in Chicago. She and her husband retired to the Villages, but she got restless. Today, she's off to an employment agency in a nearby town to be told about her new job as a temp.
My husband and I had planned that we were going to retire. I got here and I was here for about 6 months, and I just felt that my mind was going stale.
When Nancy started looking for work, she found there were plenty of vacancies in nearby towns. Whatever her age, she was badly needed back in the workplace. One of America's biggest temporary employment agencies is Norrell. Nearly 15% of those employed in Florida by this office are over 55.
Nancy, the position that we have for you, we'd like to have you go out tomorrow and talk with the customer. It's a Secretary 1 position, someone who's able to take minutes at meetings. You'll be at a forum.
What is the starting pay rate?
The starting pay is going to be around $8.50 an hour.
Norrell habitually advertises in Florida's retirement communities for workers. It's a situation that will come to the whole developed world.
Good.
What's the state of the labour market here?
There simply aren't enough people to fill the jobs that we have. We are finding that we are having to target the retirement communities, the organizations that frequent retirees in order to fill the jobs that we have open.
You're saying there's a labour shortage?
There is a labour shortage.
This is young workers?
Young workers, any workers. And by targeting the retirees, the ones that aren't necessarily considered in the workforce, they're expanding our labour market.
People who've technically stopped working?
It seems that way, yes.
But you want them to come back?
We want them to come back to work. We need them to come back to work.
In Britain, there isn't a labour shortage yet. But what Florida is experiencing will be true here soon enough. Western societies have never had such a high percentage of older people as they will over the next decade. As the ratio of workers to retired people worsens, pension entitlements may have to be curtailed and health care may have to be rationed. But there will be a way to mitigate the worst effects of the ageing crisis. We shall need to radically rethink our attitudes to what it means to be old, and to change our expectations about how long we stay at work and go on paying taxes. Already a few employers have understood the necessity for those changes. Asda is an exceptional company that already has over 600 employees of over 65. Marge Woodgate, aged 70, is greeting the customers at the opening of this new supermarket. She's unusual because in Britain, older people usually face discrimination in the job market. Marge had to retire from her last job, but like many others, wanted to stay in the workforce.
I thought, I don't think they'll have me because of my age, but surprise, surprise, they did have me. And I went along to their induction class and saw the lady and everything else. And there I am at Asda. And I'm a greeter. And I was there this morning when it opened. Very nice.
You were surprised, though, that they gave
I
it a
was
check?
surprised.
Why? Why was that?
Because of my age, they don't want to know. Some companies don't want to know elderly people, do they?
Welcome to Asda. In our produce department today, we have large oranges, 3-pack for 29p.
Sometimes at 50, 60, you're too old. But you see, the expertise with people is there, isn't it? And if they want to go to work, why shouldn't they?
To look out for all the wonderful offers on the produce department and all around the store.
At 70, Marge is exceptional now. But in years to come, many more of her age will have no choice. That's because the only way to redress the worsening dependency ratio, workers to pensioners, is for people to work for longer. Early retirement is currently the norm, but workers now in their 30s or 40s face a very different future.
Have you done your shopping? Good.
Life expectancy has increased very dramatically over the course of the last 30, 40 years. In the UK, for example, when the state pension system was first introduced in the early part of this century, the male retirement age was 65 and life expectancy was substantially less than 65, so only a small proportion of people ever got a pension at all. It makes sense now when life expectancy for men at birth now is probably close to 80 years of age, that people should not retire at 65, that they should work 5, maybe even 10 years longer.
But how can work be made attractive to those who expect to retire, rather than work on till their late 60s?
Employers will have to do a number of things to try to engage more older workers. They're going to have to make work much more desirable for them, because I think one of the things is that although a lot of older workers are forced out of the workplace, a lot are only too glad to go. And we have to think about ways of making work much more desirable. And I think that's a better balance between work and leisure, more flexible arrangements, greater autonomy in the workplace.
Former bank official Norman Holland is benefiting from exactly that. When not painting his boat, he's working 3 days a week in a local plastics factory as a machine operator, a more menial job than the one he had in financial management.
I had to sort of lower my sights and accept, within reason, some form of employment that would take me on a part-time basis to come back to. And I found that once I started integrating into the life of factory work, etc., that people did accept me. Although I found that I was working with a lot younger people than myself.
A typical 20th century early retirer, Norman may turn out to be a typical 21st century older part-timer. He represents a pointer to the imminent ageing crisis. We shall have to rethink completely how many years we can work and the sort of work we'll be able to do at the end of what will be extended working lives. Even the comfort and prosperity of the villages in Florida cannot hide the challenge that the age wave will present to the Western world. Without a change in attitudes to old age, within a few years some promises could be unaffordable and burdens on the young unbearable. The growing numbers of the old are a certainty, and forewarned we can be forearmed. The age wave is approaching and will engulf us all.